What do tanks in video games actually do compared to real life? How much destruction can they really cause? What's the difference between armor types? And how accurate are the iconic tank crewmen in Machine Gun? Tanks are usually depicted as heavily armored monsters that can go toe-to-toe with anything and steamroll all opposition. The primary purpose of a tank is to provide fire support. In reality, tank armor varies, but is generally thinner than people might expect. But in reality, tank armor is much thinner and works in a layered fashion to protect against different types of weapons. Light tanks were designed for reconnaissance and were lightly armored, but very fast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave a like and comment. They were meant to identify and report back to command on the location and strength of enemy forces. Medium tanks were the general-purpose tanks of a force, capable of engaging enemy tanks while also being able to elevate to attack enemy infantry positions. Heavy tanks were slower and less mobile than other tanks, but had much thicker armor. They were meant to be the shock troops of a force, leading the charge and engaging enemy tanks head-on. What is a tank destroyer and how does it differ from a regular tank? Tank destroyers were anti-tank vehicles that came in a variety of forms, usually had a large gun capable of elevating to attack enemy tanks, but very little armor. This made them vulnerable to enemy tanks, so they were usually deployed in areas where they wouldn't be counterattacked. Also in video games, it's common for tanks to have machine guns and be operated by 4 people. But in reality, only some tanks have machine guns, and most are operated by 3 people. Finally, in video games, tanks are often shown as being able to destroy buildings and other structures with ease. However, in reality, tanks are primarily designed to engage other tanks and other combat vehicles. They are not typically used for building demolition. Modern tanks use composite armor, which consists of several layers. The outer layer is designed to protect against kinetic energy weapons like bullets and rockets. The inner layer is designed to protect against shaped charge weapons like anti-tank mines and missiles. The space between these 2 layers is usually filled with an explosive material that detonates when struck by a shaped charge weapon, negating the threat before it reaches the main armor. This makes modern tanks incredibly effective against anti-tank mines. A tank's armor is also sloped to protect against another type of weapon called a shaped charge. Shaped charges utilize a hollow charge warhead that flies in a linear fashion. The explosion is devastating if it lands directly on a tank. But if it hits the side of a tank at an angle, the explosion will dissipate harmlessly away from the tank. This is why tanks are almost never destroyed by a single hit, unless the shot is a direct hit to the weak rear or side armor. Even if a tank is penetrated, the crew has several options to put out any fires and seal the weak spot with armored plates. They come in several varieties, but generally speaking, they redesigned to operate in an offensive battle scenario where they re-expected to destroy. Enemy tanks and other combat vehicles, while they're certainly capable of destroying buildings and providing suppressing fire, their primary role is to engage other tanks. Tanks also don't usually have secondary weapons like machine guns. While there are some exceptions, most tanks don't have the space or weight capacity to carry one. Also, the crew of a tank is normally only 3 people, a driver, gunner, and commander. However, in some Western tanks like the M1 Abrams, there is a 4th crew member whose sole responsibility is to serve as a machine gunner. But this is more of the exception rather than the norm. So while it's common to see tanks in video games equipped with machine guns and operated by 4-person crews, this isn't really the case in real life. They're slow-moving, heavily armed, and have a lot of health. Depending on the game, there might be different classes of tanks with varying degrees of armor, firepower, and mobility. Some examples include light, medium, and heavy tanks. Light tanks are usually fast, but have less armor. Medium tanks are an all-around balance of armor, firepower, and mobility. Heavy tanks are slow and have less firepower than other tanks, but have more armor. Some games also feature tank destroyers, which usually have high firepower but very little armor, and are lightly mobile. Also in video games, it's common for tanks to carry additional weaponry such as machine guns or even anti-aircraft guns. Additionally, some tanks may be equipped with minesweeping gear or smoke bombs. In this episode, we will take a look at what tanks actually do in modern warfare. Let's start with what tanks do in video games, and let's take a look at what tanks actually do in real life. In terms of armor, in video games, it's often depicted as being very thick and capable of withstanding large caliber rounds, as well as explosions from grenades and mines. So in summary, tanks in video games are often depicted as having very thick armor. Now it's time for some rapid-fire questions. What is the difference between light, medium, and heavy tanks? So now you know the difference between tanks in video games and reality.